and you think about all of your shortcomings, you think about, what you don't know, and how are we going to do this, and what's going to happen if that happens. And if you get yourself stuck in that cycle, instead of saying, no, I've heard the voice of God, I understand the call of God, I understand the will of God, so I'm going to take that step of faith. And that's what Moses had to do. All he had was the word of God, but the word of God is enough.
Welcome back, Greg. Glad to have you on.
Yeah, I've been away a while.
Yeah.
It's good to have me back.
Yeah.
I've been everywhere, and
Super busy.
thank you for holding down the fort while I was away. I really appreciate that.
It's very tough. I don't envy you at all. I mean, it's all the interviews I had to do, editing, posting.
We're going to get people second guessing whose voice they heard the last few weeks.
They're going to go back to the video. They're like, wait a minute.
I'm pretty sure it was the other guy.
The video I saw, both people had hair. Yeah.
Oh, as has become our custom, welcome back, Stephan, to the podcast.
Thank you.
You've been away a bit, but for good reason.
I only see you once a month. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we never see each other. The only time we see each other, we force each other to record. That's it.
Yeah, that's true.
But this last time you were away for good reason. You had a long-awaited trip to Europe.
I think we recorded right before I left, right?
It was like the week before, because I remember we made the joke that welcome back, and then you're going away again.
Yeah, and then so I came back from Europe, and then you were then gone for a little bit.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And then you were also gone the following weekend. So there's a reason why I haven't been on for a while.
Yeah, and we had the 3-week thing with Dr. Vonnie Marshall.
That's right.
Which didn't really want to break that up. Yeah. I don't think anyone listening wanted us to break that up, so kept that one going.
Yeah.
But through time, circumstance, and all that, it's been a bit of a gap. But it's great to have you back. Great to be back in this format. Yeah. More of a casual conversation between us two. But
it's casual when you're wearing a sweater, sweatshirt, hoodie.
Yeah, repping the merch today. Trying to stay warm here in Sydney. It's been actually quite cold. Surprisingly, it's warmed up a little bit the last few days, but for Sydney siders, we were down. I actually on Sunday, I believe it was, started up the car and there was frost on the windshield, so that was wild. Yeah. I don't think I've ever experienced that in Sydney.
It's interesting, right? Because when you think of Australia, you don't think of cold, but it gets really cold here. It's like I think it's like equivalent to like Georgia, maybe.
Probably, yeah.
Right,
well, you're not going to see snow, but
not going to see
snow,
get cold. But right, and it gets crispy.
Yeah, and if you go south, like Canberra, around Canberra, maybe not in Canberra proper, but around Canberra, they have snow. And if you go up into the mountains, there actually is snow in Australia, but but most people just see the beaches and the red dust in the desert. But you have to drive. There are Sydney siders who have never seen snow, and they're grown adults, so.
But the water is always cold, even in the summertime.
That's true. Which is nice, actually.
It's nice.
In the summer, it's nice because you're coming out of like 100-degree Fahrenheit, 40-degree Celsius into the water. It's nice, but in winter, if you don't have a wetsuit on, I don't know what you're doing out there.
Yeah, it's insane.
So how was Europe?
It's great.
You went to a few places you've already been, but I think you went to a couple places you haven't been before, right?
Yeah, so we went to... I think we talked about it before, but I think, so I went to Italy for the first time and Malta.
Oh, you hadn't been to Italy before?
Yeah, I haven't been to Italy before.
Okay,
and I went to Vienna. I've never been there. It was really nice. But I've been to Paris and I've been to London before. And those were just really nice. Seeing friends.
You actually went to the soccer game, the football game.
Yes, Tottenham.
We were talking about that last time.
Yeah, they won. It's actually incredible. Not to go over it, but they were just on a really bad run. They won, and then they just lost like 4 straight or something like that. So they lost and tied, but like they played terrible, and then they won their last game. So like if there was a game to go to in the last like 8 games of the stretch to the end of the season, that was like the perfect one to go to. Yeah. And I will say, if there's any Brighton fans listening, I don't probably not, but the refs did give us the win, so they knew I was going to be going there. But you know what? I'll take it.
Yeah, for sure. So Malta for the first time. Taylor,
Yeah.
she's Maltese.
Taylor cried as soon as she hit, the motherland.
Did she really?
No, she didn't. No, she
was about to
jumped
say
down on her
that's
knees
like-
and was like, "I'm here."
And started eating pasta.
Yeah, patitis are great.
Yeah.
Malta is amazing. If you haven't been, it's like this little small island. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's less than 40 kilometers from the bottom to the top of the
Wow.
main island,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, you run that on a,
Mm.
on
Yeah,
a
on a
daily
marathon.
basis.
If you run, I wish I was running that. But in a marathon, yeah, it's a marathon.
Yeah, so it's a really
less.
it's a really small island, but it's beautiful, and you see you see history in it.
Well, Malta is in the Bible, which is pretty cool.
Yeah,
And
it's true.
stop over in the island of Malta.
But like you go there and you're like, oh, is it still in the Bible? Like it's literally, it looks the same, and it's really cool about it.
That's cool. So this would have been like, was this your first time going to places that were actually in the Bible, like possibly in the Bible? Malta. You went to Rome? Did you go to Rome as well?
Yeah, I went to Rome as well. That is, as a Christian, I should have probably thought of that.
Oh, they're pretty obscure. It's not like Jerusalem,
No, but
not like
yeah,
our mother-in-law.
No, but like, yeah, you hear about Paul and he goes to different places and yeah, but I never thought about it like that. That was like the first time. Oh wow,
Pretty cool.
yeah. I wish you told me about that before. I would have been more.
Well, they told me when I was in the Gulf States last year. They said that there's belief that Job came from that region. So that would have been my closest interaction. But yeah, I got a bit of FOMO going on looking at our mother-in-law's trip to Jerusalem. And
Are you sure Paul didn't come to Sydney?
He did. That was on like his fourth journey.
Yeah,
the one that
so.
they didn't write about.
I mean, he just probably stayed here because it's so beautiful.
Yeah. I think this is the fourth heaven. I'm pretty sure Sydney's the fourth.
Yeah, it is.
Oh man, well, it's good to have you back, and hopefully you enjoyed that. That was your second year anniversary, right? You were celebrating.
Yeah. Beautiful food, beautiful, and it tastes very well.
Yeah, of course.
I really, it was a great time.
Yeah, you saw the Australian influence on you right there, because when we say beautiful food in Australia, we mean it tastes good at the same time.
Yeah, I'm getting.
So you're all confused there for a second.
Australian. Yeah, I'm like, what am I talking about?
Well, we're coming up, speaking of 2 years, we're coming up to 2 years of the podcast.
Yeah.
At the end of June.
A lot of anniversaries coming.
Yeah.
2 years of me living here in Australia.
That's right.
Yeah, it's coming along.
Yeah.
But yeah, 2 years of the podcast. This is huge.
Yeah, pretty cool. I mean, the 100 episode mark, I think, was, to me, more significant.
See,
in
the 2 years for me is more.
Really?
I don't know. I'm just trying to be different. No, but this is big. Like, I mean, yes, 100 episodes is big because you can say you've been doing something for 2 years, right? But if you only had 12 episodes,
yeah.
I think I understand what you're talking about. The effort you're putting into each episode, it matters more. And so it's not about like, obviously you want to have great content and you want to make sure you're putting 100% into it. But at the same time, what's your output?
Yeah.
And the 100 episode is the result of hard work and dedication. So I completely understand where you're coming from.
Yeah. And then the 2 years is also like, especially if you're doing it consistently, it's a good marker of you being consistent and actually doing it. So it's been cool. Some of you who listen or watch, you can say that you were there from day one when we were getting 20 to 50 downloads an episode.
Yeah, it was crazy.
But this last month, May, was our biggest month ever on the podcast. It was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And most audio downloads, most views on YouTube. So
followers on Instagram.
Yeah. Finally, we eclipsed 25,000.
Yeah.
We'd been in like right around in the 24,000s for a while. So it was cool to get that round number. Me being a number person, it's the 5 just looks cleaner.
It does. It does. It just makes it just like
it just looks better.
It just fits better, you know?
Yeah. And we've put out some merch. We've got some merch for those of you guys who haven't seen it online yet. I'm wearing one of the hoodies that we've got, but this is just a way for us to try and get some revenue to put back into the podcast.
Absolutely.
Like I said, we've been doing it for 2 years, and we want to keep making it better. We want to get some of our own equipment. We borrow a lot of equipment. All the audio stuff is ours, but some of the video stuff we borrow. So we'd love to be able to get some of our own stuff. And finally, we're only weeks away from me moving into my new house.
Weeks. That is huge.
This whole podcast, the entirety of this podcast, I have not lived in my own home.
Well,
so.
I think from the beginning of your podcast,
that's right.
You're like, okay, so in 3 months, I'm gonna. I think you started this podcast knowing, like, okay, you know what? If I start it now, I'll be able to get into my house 2 years later.
Yeah.
And then,
still
waiting.
If I forget which episode we talked about this, but we talked about video.
Right.
And how I didn't introduce video at the beginning because it was like, well, I don't have a setup.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, I'm going to wait till we have a proper setup, studio, whatever. And then it kept extending out. And I was like, well, I've got to do it, because if I don't, then who knows? So
who knows when, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of trickles into like what we were probably going to talk about today, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That leads us nicely into our discussion here, Dave. We're going to talk a little bit about imposter syndrome, but as sort of like a launching out point, a lot of us would have heard of what imposter syndrome is. But we're going to look at a story in the Bible of where we see an example of that, and how oftentimes we experience that. You know, the last couple months we've been really dealing with following what Simeon Costa called the God dream, or following the dream that God has given you, that is unique to you. It's not something that has to be in a box. It doesn't have to be something. We talked about a little bit like that with Kristen and some of our other guests. You know, different ways of doing ministry, not just the typical ones that we're used to doing. And so I thought this would be a good thing to, this doesn't have to be a long discussion, but a discussion about following the call of God. Why is it that we stumble at the start often, and how it is that we can move through that? In fact, this episode is probably going to get out before the conversation that sparked this idea gets out. Had Nate Whitley on, had a conversation with him earlier this week, and that episode will be out soon. But he mentioned that. He mentioned one of the things that young people deal with, that people in general deal with when they're following the call of God, is this imposter syndrome, where they feel like, they're unable. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe for those who don't know, what is imposter syndrome?
Yeah, so this imposter syndrome, first of all, happens to everyone, right? It's not something and it happens in all different facets of your life. So it can be in school, it can be in work, it can be in ministry, but it normally creeps in when you feel like the amount of work that you put in won't result in the output of what may require you to do something. So, for example, if you have this, if you're going to be speaking at this conference, for example, you may feel that you're, not good enough to do something, and that fear that creeps in is imposter syndrome. It's you're like, wow, what am I doing here? You start questioning yourself. What am I doing here? Am I even good enough to do this? Why isn't someone else doing it? I understand that I put in work, but I don't think that I'm good enough for it. And this happens in different areas of our life, and it's actually like what we're going to be talking about. It's in the Bible.
Yeah. And I think it's important that we understand, and that's kind of what we want to get at here today, is that, as you said, it's not just something that you experience, but it's something that everyone experiences.
Right.
They really do. There might be someone out there that has just extreme self-confidence and they don't. But it's quite rare that someone will get to a stage where they don't feel like maybe they're a bit of an imposter. And it might be because of the standards that we set for ourselves, or the society seems to set.
I think at one point everyone has felt it. I think it's not something that someone might say, no, I've never felt imposter syndrome, but maybe their approach or their reaction to it is different than the typical.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So maybe they feel like, I'm not good enough, but you know what? I'm just going to give it my best. And that's all that matters. So their approach to feeling like they're not good enough, or maybe their approach to, their approach to something is like, well, you know what? I can only give it my all. So that's sort of their,
Yeah, it could be like a fleeting feeling.
Right.
Not something that actually settles
exactly.
in.
But for most of us, I feel that if we're doing something for the first time, we're going to be nervous. I remember when we first started talking on this podcast, I was like, we're messing up so many times. And I'm like, how many takes can I get? And, even to this day, we still have it. But it's ultimately like the more we did it, it's just we got comfortable.
Yeah.
But especially with the first time you're doing something, you're going to have that fear. And I struggle with fear a lot, right? Because, when you feel like you can't do something, you want to be a perfectionist, but, will I hit my target?
Yeah. Yeah. And you put yourself out there. And there are times where it's unavoidable. You have to put yourself out there if you're going to fulfill what God is calling you to do or what you're wanting to do. And as you alluded to, there is a great example in the Bible. It's found in Exodus 3. And it's Moses when he has that burning bush experience that so many of us know about and is often talked about when we're talking about following the call of God. And so, the bush calls out to him and he responds to it. He turns and responds to the bush. And this conversation takes place between him and God. And God basically tells him, the Israelites have cried out to me. I'm sending them a deliverer. You're the deliverer. And Moses is like, who am I?
Yeah.
Like, how am I going to speak to Pharaoh? How am I going to lead these people? Like, who am I? And that's a classic example of imposter syndrome.
But that's actually, I love that you specifically said that he called out, right? It's very important to talk about it. It's okay to talk about to talk about this with someone if you're feeling that way, because sometimes we can get all into our own head, and instead of talking about it, it's not going to make the situation worse. It's actually going to make it better. Talking about it and getting out of your own head is like one of the first things that you should do. So in Moses saying, who am I? It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not going to, make him feel more like an imposter. It's actually going to allow him to open up and realize, listen, you're not an imposter. Let's really focus on what we're trying to do here, and you can do it.
That's a great point. Because as you said, if you internalize everything, and then it's like this vicious cycle that takes place, and you're never talking to somebody else, and somebody else can see the potential and you can see the value in you, and they see it and you may not.
Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about it with someone you trust, right? Like, he was talking.
Not someone's going to shoot you down.
But ultimately,
dream killer.
You can talk about him. Am I good enough? And he's like, nope.
I don't know what you're doing.
No, because then you'll go back to your internal thoughts, and that'll be bad. But you want to talk about it with someone you trust, someone that's going to be there, maybe a mentor, maybe someone that you look up to, and someone that you trust. And that way, you can get out of your own head and realize, listen, this is just fear, and everyone has this emotion.
Yeah. And so when he says that, who am I? It's interesting. I preached a sermon a number of years ago diving into who Moses really was. So we talk about him being drawn from the water and all of that, but it's in actual fact, a lot of the details that we know about Moses' life prior to him being called out of the wilderness, a lot of the details we find from Stephen's sermon in Acts when he's talking about all of Jewish history, and he goes into detail about Moses, and he says that Moses was a man that was powerful in speech, and that he'd been raised in Pharaoh's house. He had all of the skills. He had everything that you could possibly need in order to lead a group of slaves. Or we're talking about slaves. We're talking about people who have been in captivity. They didn't have a leader who knew what to do. No. Whereas this guy's been raised in nobility in the house, and so he's got an education that's afforded only to him. He has experience in the wilderness, which he would need later.
Right.
He had all this experience, and God knew it, and that's why God called him.
Well, that's why it's called imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
right? It's not like there are actually imposters out there.
Yeah.
But imposter syndrome is like when you do put the work in, but you still feel like that work isn't good enough. He grew up in that situation where he was good enough, but his doubts started to creep in.
Yeah. And the only way that you can push through that is, a few ways, but one of them is what you talked about is verbalizing and talk to someone else about how you're feeling, and they can help you. Someone that you can trust with your dreams, the dreams that God has given you. Another thing is take it to the Lord in prayer. And obviously Moses is in conversation with God.
Yep.
And so Moses is saying, who am I? How am I going to be able to do this? I can't do this. And God responds to him and basically says, yeah, but I'm able.
Yeah.
I'm able. I'm the one that's calling you. I'm the one that's leading you.
That's huge.
So put your faith, your trust in me.
Yeah, with your faith, if God is opening a door in your life and you feel like you're not good enough to walk through that door, you're not just doubting yourself, but you're doubting the door that God opened. You actually slightly are doubting God, right?
Yeah,
and that's something that we don't want to fall into because it's only going to limit us.
Yeah, and the reason this was poignant, this actually came up, this scripture came up this week at our small group on the Central Coast. We're doing a Bible study talking about the Exodus. And it just made me think about, the first, and it's still ongoing. It's an ongoing process, but I remember the first preview service that we had, and I'm just standing around, walking around, looking like a deer in the headlights, because it's like, okay, well, like, it's here.
Yeah.
People are here. Worship is about to happen. People have come. We've invested all of this time and energy into this, and I'm leading this. Like, this is very strange, because I'm used to always being in rooms where I'm supporting a leader,
right.
Which is what we need to do if we're not the main leader in a room. But it was just, there was that moment where it was like, what am I doing here? But even going back to when I first felt the call to start a work, it's like, who am I? Like, why do I think that I can help pastor people? Why do I think that I can help lead people? And you think about all of your shortcomings. You think about, what you don't know, and how are we going to do this, and what's going to happen if that happens. And if you get yourself stuck in that cycle, instead of saying, no, I've heard the voice of God, I understand the call of God, I understand the will of God, so I'm going to take that step of faith. And that's what Moses had to do. All he had was the word of God, but the word of God is enough. If he's spoken in our life, if he has called us. And I guess that's the difference between a God dream and just a dream. If this is something from God, you don't have to do it with your own strength, but you've got him, and you can put your faith and your trust in him, knowing that you're in his will. And if God has spoken it, he's going to perform it. He's going to be the one that's going to help you get the job done in the end,
Yeah, that's super interesting what you just said, right? It's, a lot of times we just think of imposter syndrome, that we're only by ourselves, it's like, well, I'm the imposter, but no, we have God right next to us and assisting us. And the journey that we take with our Christian lives, it's he's always been with us. So what makes you think when you come to something that you're at a crossroad and you're going to be taking this next step, right? And you're going to be, what makes you think he's not going to be that same God that
even more so?
Yeah, because he understands where you're at even more than how we understand ourselves. So he knows he's going to be with you.
Yeah.
And so it's like we have to have that confidence in God that, Lord, I feel like I'm not ready, but I know that you know that I'm ready. And in doing this, I'm going to just step in faith, and you're going to guide me, and I'm going to do my best.
Yeah, that's great. And I think we'll finish up with this. When he was in conversation with God, he asked the Lord for his name. He's like, if I'm going to go, if I'm going to do this, I don't necessarily want to. I don't think I'm prepared for this. But if I'm going to take this step of faith, can you at least tell me who's sending me? What's your name? What should I say to the children of Israel? And God replies, he said, tell them I am who I am. And basically what that means is, he's the I am. He is what you need him to be. So if you need him to be a deliverer, he'll be a deliverer. If you need him to be a waymaker, if you need him to be a provider, if you need him to be a comfort, if you need him to be a helper, if you need him to be a miracle worker, if you need him to do something in your life, as long as it is in agreement with his will and his purpose, he is more than able to do it. And I think Moses says, "Who am I?" And God says, "I am." Really, really cool. And when we put our faith, when we put our trust in him, we can know that, hey, it's not necessarily about us, but it's about the person. It's about God who has called us and the work that he has called us to do. So I want to encourage you guys, don't be an imposter. Make sure that you are trusting in the will of God, trusting in the purpose of God, and see what he will do in your life and through you.